and heads our employment practice group. John and I have practiced together for 17 years with many common clients, and John handles the employment issues that relate to the firm's clients and many of the businesses in this valley and statewide. John has taken the lead on behalf of our employment group to understand vaccine mandates, whether the mandates were voluntarily imposed without the government mandate months ago or the ones that are being imposed now with the government mandate. John has carefully reviewed those regulations and is prepared to help you understand what will happen with that mandate in the coming weeks. So we appreciate this opportunity. And John, with that introduction, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Tom, and thanks to the Chamber for having me here today. Hey, let me start with just a little bit of background and share with you what I've been doing pretty much full time in the last week since these vaccine mandates came out, and then really for the last couple months ever since the whole issue of vaccination mandates came out. It's pretty much what I've been doing for our business clients, is helping folks figure out these vaccination mandate issues. Jeremy, should I share my screen here now, or is it already up?
Definitely. Here we go.
Let me explain kind of what I'm gonna talk about here today. We've got this set up. I've got some slides, and if folks listening in here would like to request copies of the slides, just reach out to me, and I'm happy to share them. And also, as we're going on here, if you want to type in some questions into the chat, we will try to answer some of those questions as we go. Like I said, pretty much what I've been doing the last, pretty much full time the last week, and then even before that, is helping companies figure out these vaccination mandate issues. I want to start this by saying what I'm not going to do today is get into the politics and the public policy issues over whether these vaccination mandates are good or bad, or should be stopped by the courts, or all that kind of stuff. I will explain kind of the process that they've gone through. I'm not going to spend any time talking about the politics of this stuff. I understand that some businesses are in favor of this, some are very much opposed to it. Different people have different perspectives on these vaccine mandate issues, and I respect that, but I'm not going to get into those types of debates in this. I'll tell you what I am going to do today. I'm going to start by summarizing the key provisions of, in particular, this new OSHA vaccine mandate, which requires companies, any private companies with more than 100 employees, to implement some policies and procedures related to COVID vaccines. I'm going to try to share some business strategies with you all. What we do here at Holy Trox, so we represent businesses, and I'm not just going to share with you what the rules say, but rather we're going to talk about the different strategies that companies can put into place, both to comply with the OSHA regulations, but also to do so in a way that will reduce, to the extent possible, the negative impacts that come along with these vaccine mandates. I think they're very tough on businesses, and I'm going to try to talk to you about ways that you can do this in a way that's not going to harm your business. The issue that everyone is asking about right now is really, is the OSHA vaccination mandate really going to go through? Is this really going to happen? Are the courts going to stop it? Towards the end of this presentation, I will explain that issue. I will explain the current status of the lawsuits, what that means on employers. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to try to give you a roadmap of exactly what we think businesses should be doing right now as far as taking steps to deal with this OSHA vaccination rule. I'm going to give you real specific guidance as to what we think you should do, what we think you should do now, and then also what we think you should do once these issues kind of get sorted out with the court. So that's what I'm going to cover here today. Like I said, we're happy to answer questions as we go, or we may answer some of those at the end. And if any of you all have questions that you'd like to you'd like to give to us directly afterwards, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk to businesses about these issues. So like I said, I'm gonna start with really just what are the rules of this thing, but I want to share a little bit of background. A couple of months ago, the White House issued what they call the path out of the pandemic. And that path actually involves 3 different kinds of what we're referring to as vaccination mandates. And we have been helping businesses comply and figure out how to deal with all 3 of these. The first one that came out is a requirement that companies that have federal contracts require their employees to be vaccinated. I refer to that program as a true vaccination mandate, because what the government is saying to its federal contractor companies is that they are absolutely required to mandate that their employees be vaccinated, subject to some medical and religious exemptions. That's why I call it a true vaccination mandate. Those employees of those companies really are required to be vaccinated against COVID-19. The other one that Tom and I in particular have been working with our healthcare business clients over the last week now is what I call the CMS healthcare worker mandate. And it also is a vaccination mandate in that the government is telling hospitals, long-term healthcare facilities, and other healthcare providers that are governed by Medicare or Medicaid that they have to require their employees to be vaccinated. So again, that's a true vaccination mandate. The third one, which is what we're going to spend our time talking about here today, is this OSHA rule. And what the OSHA rule says is that any private employers with more than 100 employees have to implement a policy. A lot of people have been calling this a vaccination mandate. I think that's a misnomer. In a lot of ways, it really is not a vaccination mandate. Rather, what it is it's an order that requires employees to do one of 2 things: either to require their employees to be vaccinated, or to require any employees who are not vaccinated to go through testing. So the government actually is not specifically requiring anyone under this OSHA rule to be vaccinated. That's an issue on which a lot of people have some confusion. Let me explain what the choices are for employers, and this is the real big issue that goes to the decision that these companies are going to need to, that all companies with over 100 employees are going to need to figure out what they want to do. I'll read to you, or I'll explain to you what the regulations say. The regulation starts by saying that any company with over 100 employees must develop, implement, and enforce a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy. Now, that's why people are calling this a vaccination mandate, right? It starts by saying employers have to have a policy that mandates COVID-19 vaccination. But there's a big but, or there's a big except. The very next line goes on to say that the exception to this is that instead of mandating the vaccine, companies can instead implement a policy that simply says that employees have to either be vaccinated or undergo weekly testing and wear a face mask if they're not vaccinated. So that's the choice that employers have.
So John, let me interrupt you there. What choice do you believe, or are you seeing employers making, and what factors are they considering in which of these 2 paths to take?
Yeah, that really is the big question, Tom, that businesses have to make a decision on. And let me explain how I think most companies are going to make this decision, and the companies that I've been working with are making this decision. I would say that the vast majority of companies in Idaho are going to pick the second of these 2 approaches. The vast majority of Idaho companies are going to say, we don't want to require our employees to be vaccinated. Instead, we're going to allow them this option of being tested instead. But let me explain kind of the factors that I think companies are going through in making this decision. Some companies are going to use this OSHA vaccination rule as an opportunity to implement a true vaccination mandate for their employees. Some companies are going to err on the side of safety and precautions and really trying to increase the percentage of their workplace that is vaccinated. And the companies that I see most likely to do that are the companies that are faced with the biggest risk of COVID outbreaks in the workplace. Manufacturing facilities, where people are closely packed together, workplaces where it's not possible to socially distance, healthcare providers. Those are the types of companies that I think may lean towards an actual mandate. I think that probably 95% of companies in Idaho are going to take the view that they don't want to require that instead they want to encourage employees to be vaccinated and then allow them to be tested in lieu of vaccination. But that's the policy decision that Idaho companies are going to need to come up with, is which of those two approaches they want to take. Let me cover some of the nuts and bolts of how this how the OSHA regulations are going to play out, assuming that they don't get stopped by the courts, which I'll cover at the end of this presentation here. The first question being, who all is covered by this, by the OSHA vaccination rules? As it's set up on the slide right here, it's really every single private employer, whether you're for-profit or non-for-profit, you're going to be covered by this OSHA. We call it the ETS. You're going to be covered by this. The people who are not covered by this, by the OSHA regulations, are the companies that instead are required to follow either the federal contractor mandate or the CMS mandate. So if you're a healthcare employer, you're going to be covered by the CMS mandate, which is more strict. If you're a federal contractor, you're going to have to follow the federal contractor mandate, which is much more strict. And if you're not one of those two, you're going to fall under the OSHA regulations that give you much more flexibility in the way you want to set this out. Also, as to which of your employees this covers, for the most part, these OSHA vaccination rules are going to apply to all of your employees, other than your employees who are 100% remote employees. Employees who work from home, they're not going to fall under this. Remote employees who work from home are pretty much the ones who are not covered by this, or employees who work exclusively outdoors. They don't have to follow these OSHA rules either. But for the most part, almost every company is going to have all of their employees that show up to the actual workplace are going to be required to follow these rules. Let me talk about the deadlines. This is the important part as far as what you need to do and when you need to do it. The big rule is that by December 5th, which is only a few weeks away from now, every employer that falls under this OSHA vaccination rule is required to implement a written policy stating what its policy is going to be as to employee vaccinations. That's the requirement. The requirement is that you have a written policy and that you communicate that policy to your employees by December 5th. That's coming up on us pretty quick. And that's the first step that employers are going to need to make, is to prepare that policy, which we have helped a lot of businesses prepare, and then communicate that policy to your employees. Also, by December 5th, every company is going to be required to determine the vaccination status of your employees. Meaning what you actually have to do is do a survey with your employees, have your employees tell you yes or no they are or are not vaccinated. Again, regardless of whether you're going to require anyone to be vaccinated, what you have to do under this OSHA rule is to do a survey under which you will find out the vaccination status of all of your employees. And then the real implementation, or the next implementation date, is January 4th. January 4th is the date by which employees have to either be vaccinated or start testing in lieu of vaccination. And what that means is that as of January 4th, any employees who are not fully vaccinated will have to take a COVID test on a weekly basis in order to work, at least in the main workplace, as opposed to working from their home. So those are the big deadlines that employers are faced with, assuming that the OSHA rule continues as it's currently set out. I want to talk about some of the key definitions that are in this OSHA vaccination rule. The rule revolves around this concept of employees being fully vaccinated. It states that employees have to be either fully vaccinated by January 4th or test on a weekly basis. And fully vaccinated, as you probably know, basically means that you have finished receiving the COVID vaccine, whether it is the 2-shot Pfizer or Moderna vaccine or the one-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That's the requirement, is that the employees have to have gone through one of those two vaccination processes. So they're not fully vaccinated until they've finished that, and then 2 weeks after they had the last shot is when an employee is considered to be fully vaccinated under these OSHA rules. Then the other part of this, where there's a definition in the OSHA rules, is what it means to be is what the COVID testing requirement is. So the requirement says that any employee who is not fully vaccinated has to take a test on a weekly basis. And then there's a definition in the regulations of what that means, what the COVID test is. And what I've got up on the screen is some of the technical verbiage of what qualifies as a COVID test. But basically it has to be an FDA approved test. It cannot be simply an over-the-counter test that the employee both takes and then interprets themselves, right? It can't just be like that spit test. It has to be either a point of care test, meaning you go to a testing facility to do it, or it can be a proctored test, or it can be a test that the employer actually administers at the workplace, where they give you the test and then they, read or interpret the results there in that place. So it can't just be that the employee takes the test on their own. They have to do it through one of these more formal processes, which is going to be a challenge for employers because of the availability of these tests, right? It may be a very challenging thing for employers to procure a sufficient number of tests, or to help employees line up the ability to go get tested on a weekly basis. Let me talk through what I see as the two options that employers have here, right? First, either doing an actual mandatory vaccination policy, or allowing employees to test in lieu, and just talk you through what the general requirements are and what your employees will have to go through. The option number one, being the mandatory vaccination policy, means just that. It means that the employer would issue a policy that says we are going to require all employees to be vaccinated, to be fully vaccinated by January 4th, with the exception that employees can request either a medical exemption or a religious exemption. Now that's a complicated process, just like it kind of sounds, right? It sounds tough to go through this process of allowing employees to submit for either a religious or a medical exemption, and it is kind of complicated. Basically, what you would do is you would provide employees with a form that they can fill out, where they either take a medical form to their doctor to have their doctor explain why they should not be vaccinated, or they explain on this accommodation form how being vaccinated would contradict their sincerely held religious beliefs. That's a process that lots of companies have been doing already. People have kind of figured out how to do this. It's it's a process that like I said, a lot of companies are going through where they allow their employees to request these exemptions. The OSHA rules require that if a company is going to mandate the vaccine, that they allow this procedure under which employees can request one of these exemptions. And what I can tell you for certain, because we've worked with several companies going through this, is that if a company does require their employees to be vaccinated, you will have a lot of your employees request these medical and religious exemptions. And then you'll have to go through the process of reviewing these. I have literally reviewed hundreds of these religious or medical exemption forms to help companies figure out where to grant and where to deny those. But so it's a process that's kind of being figured out as we go. For any company, whether you decide to mandate the vaccine or to allow testing in lieu of vaccination, the process that you have to go through is you have to require your employees to establish or to prove to you their vaccination status. What you actually have to do is, or what we're recommending that you do, and what the regulations contemplate, is that you send out a survey to your employees where they check a box stating whether they are or are not vaccinated. And if they are vaccinated, they actually have to provide the company with proof of their vaccination status. I've listed here on this slide the ways they can prove that, but really the best way to do it is for them just to provide a copy of their vaccination card, right? They make a photocopy or a photo of it, they provide it to the company. The company actually has to keep a record of this. You have to keep a log or a spreadsheet of all of your employees and identify whether they are or are not vaccinated, and then keep on hand a copy of their vaccination record. That may sound surprising to some of you and concerning, in that a lot of people view those vaccine cards as medical records, and in some ways they are. But what the government has said under these OSHA rules is that companies are required to collect that information and to hold it confidentially, right? Not to share it with others, to keep it in a separate files that are protected from being viewed by others. That's what we're required to do under these OSHA rules. So that's option number one, is to actually mandate the vaccine for your employees. Option number two, which is where most Idaho employers are probably headed towards, is where you allow employees to be tested instead of being vaccinated. What I've got up here on this slide is what the rules say about how to do that. It basically means that once per week, employees have to test, and they have to provide the result of those tests to the company. There's some different, more complicated rules about employees who don't work in the workplace very often. They only come in periodically. They actually have to test within the 7 days before they show up at the workplace. So basically, anyone who's going to be at the physical workplace has to test at least once per week. That's the basic rule under these new OSHA regulations. The next topic that's explained in these regulations, and let me maybe pause here and say something that's interesting here. The OSHA rule in some ways sounds simple, right? It just says that companies have to either mandate the vaccine or allow employees to test in lieu of being vaccinated. That in a lot of ways sounds kind of simple. The regulations that the government sent us are about 400 and I think it's like 470 pages long. I printed out a copy of it right here so you can see it. There's a lot of detail in this stuff that makes it hard to figure out how to prepare a policy that explains all this stuff. But the issue at hand here, one of the main questions that's been being asked is, who pays for the testing? And what the regulations say very clearly is that employers are not required to cover the cost. Employers can push the cost onto their employees, unless you're in a state that has a law saying that the company cannot push the cost of testing onto employees, which Idaho does not have. We do not currently have a law that says that companies cannot do that. Hey, Tom, you're on mute there.
Sorry about that. You'd think I'd learned that after 22 months of being on Zoom. In your experience, what are businesses doing as far as requiring employees to cover the cost of that testing?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, Tom. So again, the rule is employers get to choose. Does the employer want to pay for it themselves, or do they want to require employees to pay for it? I think as companies are making this choice, they have to weigh a couple of policy perspectives. On one hand, and frankly, this is the reason that the Biden administration has set up the rule this way is, frankly, I think that they want to put some of this cost on employees because that will help encourage employees to make the decision to be vaccinated, right? They're kind of stuck with this choice of either being vaccinated or have to test on a weekly basis and potentially have to pay the cost of that testing. So if the company's priority and what you want to focus on truly is getting as many people in your workplace vaccinated as possible, then one way to do that, one way to incentivize employees to do that is to say they have to pay the cost of the testing, right? And so some companies are going to go in that direction. I actually think most companies will go in that direction because that would be the way to encourage employees to be vaccinated. The flip side to that is that if a company is worried about losing employees over this rule, which frankly is a concern, I think, to most companies, or if what you're trying to do is not burden employees with the cost of this, right? If what you want to do is support employees on this and make it make it less burdensome on employees, then the company would simply decide to pay for this themselves. That's the policy decision that the company is going to have to make. I actually see this as an even split. About half the companies we're working with say that they want to pay for the testing themselves so that employees don't have to, and to try to lose or try to not lose employees over this. Other companies are saying they want to require employees to pay for it so that employees have some skin in the game as far as making the decision. That's what I've been seeing with the businesses I've been working with. The next piece to these OSHA regulations is a requirement that employees who test positive be removed from the workplace, right? So the whole point of this, or one of the big points of the OSHA rules, is that employees have to be vaccinated or they have to test. And when they test, if they test positive, they obviously can't come to work for a period of time. The regulations set this out. They basically say that any employee who tests positive, first of all, has to report that to the company, and that the company is required to exclude that employee from the workplace for a period of time. Now, in some companies, that may mean they just work from home for a while, if that's a possibility, or it may mean that they're off work for a short period of time. And the rules set that out, but they basically say the employee has to be out for a certain number of days under the CDC regulations. I think it's 10 days before they return to work, or they have to have a negative test before they can return to work, or they have to have a recommendation from their doctor that they're safe to return to work. So there's a process they have to go through before they return. One of the points I want to make clear here is that an employee who tests positive and is removed from the workplace because of that, the company actually does not have to pay that employee while they're off of work. This isn't like the old Families First Act provisions that have now expired, where the company would have to pay the employee while they're out. The company is not required to do so, although I think some companies will voluntarily decide that they want to provide that employee with paid leave, or they may just allow that employee to use their PTO or sick leave. That's all up to the company, and that's part of what you would set out in your policy as you're developing this. The other piece to the OSHA regulations is a masking requirement. Although in the language of the regulations, they're called face coverings, but we all know they're masks, right? That's what we call them. The rules say that any employee who is not vaccinated is required to wear a mask whenever they're in the workplace. And there's actually, this is an area in which these OSHA regulations are very strict compared to what we've seen before. The regulations make very clear that an employee who is not vaccinated is going to be required to wear a mask pretty much at all times while at work, unless they are in a private office with ceiling and walls and a closed door, right? If you're behind closed doors, you don't have to, if you're alone behind closed doors, you don't have to wear a mask, or while you're actively eating or drinking, or some more narrow exceptions that would apply in the construction field or in hazardous workplaces where the company has come to a conclusion that wearing a mask would be hazardous. And an example of that might be if you're in a situation where having glasses fog up due to a mask could create a work hazard. There is some leeway that employers have to create some exceptions for masking. But really what's happening here is it's a very strict rule that says that unvaccinated employees have to wear a mask pretty much all the time at work, other than some very narrow exceptions. Again, that's going to be one of the incentives that employees have to be vaccinated, is that it would relieve them of the requirement to have to wear a mask so much of the time, right? That's one of the incentives that's built into this whole program. I've covered this to some extent already. The OSHA regulations explain that the company has to provide for what they call reasonable accommodations from these requirements, either for medical, meaning disability, or religious reasons. And this comes into play in a couple of different contexts. First of all, if you're going to go the approach of an actual vaccination mandate requiring employees to be vaccinated, you have to allow the employees the opportunity to request a medical or religious exemption. But these accommodations are actually a little bit broader than that. Even those companies, most companies that will end up not actually mandating the vaccine, but instead allowing employees to test in lieu of vaccination, there's still an element of exemptions here. So those employees who are not vaccinated will be required to wear a mask or test on a weekly basis. And what the regulations say is that those employees have to be given an opportunity or the availability to actually request an exemption from those requirements. If there's a medical reason that they shouldn't wear a mask, or a medical reason or a religious reason that they shouldn't be tested on a weekly basis, I think that's going to be hard for employees to establish either of those exemptions. But what the regulations say is that the company has to have a process for allowing employees to submit those exemptions. I see this as another place where the way you write up your policy is going to make a big impact on how much you have to go through this process, right? How much you want to advertise this possibility of exemptions from those requirements. In a lot of ways, I think one of the strategies in preparing the policy is going to be making those exemptions available to employees, but not so much of an invitation, or not advertising that so much in a way that's really going to create a lot of burden on your administrative or your human resources staff to address those requests for accommodation. So there's kind of some ways that you can prepare a policy that will help alleviate some of the burden related to this particular area of exemptions and accommodations. The other piece to these OSHA regulations are some very specific rules about what employers have to pay for as far as their employees being either vaccinated or if they experience side effects from being vaccinated. Let me explain specifically what the regulations require. The regulations say that every company has to provide employees with up to 4 hours of paid leave for that employee to go get vaccinated. So any of your employees who are not yet vaccinated that are gonna go get vaccinated now, the company has to provide them with up to 4 hours of paid time off to do so. That would include travel time, all that. I'm not sure that this really makes a lot of sense here in Boise, and then it takes about 15 minutes to go get vaccinated. But that's what the rules say, is that we have to provide a reasonable amount of paid time off for employees to go get vaccinated, up to 4 hours. And this is not simply a matter of allowing the employee to use their PTO to go get vaccinated. It's that the company has to provide up to 4 additional hours of new paid time off for the employee to go get vaccinated. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is that when you have employees who go and get vaccinated and then have side effects or symptoms from the vaccine, which is relatively common, that if those side effects impact that employee's ability to come to work for up to 2 days, that the company has to provide some paid leave for that. And in some ways, this is really easy to explain, right? Those of us that have been vaccinated, you know this. I didn't have any symptoms at all. A lot of people don't have any symptoms at all. Some people, when they get the vaccine, particularly the second dose, experience some flu-like symptoms, right? We know that. We all know people who have had a hard time with the vaccines. And what this rule says is that an employee who experiences those side effects can take up to 2 days off of work to deal with those side effects, and that the company has to provide paid time off for that. This one is interesting in that, unlike the 4 hours of paid leave to get vaccinated, these 2 days of paid leave to deal with side effects can actually just come out of the employee's PTO or their paid sick leave if the company provides that. Now, if the employee does not have PTO or does not have accrued sick leave, then the company would have to provide additional paid leave for this. And again, this is a place where companies can make a decision whether they want to provide this additional 2 days of pay on top of their current PTO policies, or if they just want to say that employees can take PTO if they're experiencing side effects. And there's some strategy decisions that come into that as far as how the company wants to deal with that, right? Frankly, if you voluntarily decide to provide two free days of PTO for employees who experience side effects from being vaccinated, frankly, lots of your employees are going to take advantage of those 2 days, right? Right or wrong, lots of employees are going to say, I'm going to take those 2 days. And I think a company is going to have to make a decision on whether they want to facilitate that by providing those 2 free days, or if they want to say, employees, you can take those 2 days, but that's going to come out of your PTO or your sick time. I think that's a challenging decision for you to figure out which approach to take there.
Hey, John, can the employers require that the employees get vaccinated on Friday?
You know what? The regulations don't specifically speak to that, right? That's an interesting concept, because it would from a practical perspective, from the employer's perspective, that would be the best thing, right? Employee be vaccinated on a Friday. Then if you've got any symptoms on Saturday or Sunday, then you don't have to worry about paid time off. I don't think that a company can specifically require that. The regulations don't speak to it, but I suspect that we probably can't require employees to do that. Interesting concept, Tom. I want to talk a little bit about the record-keeping requirement, what it is that employers are required to do. The regulations say that the employer is required to maintain a roster of your employees' vaccination status. And what that really means is, first of all, you send out a survey to all of your employees where they have to check the box and say they are or are not vaccinated. Then the company keeps a record of that, along with copies of the actual documentation. And the company keeps all that stuff, right? You got to keep it confidential and private so that other people don't see it. But that is the requirement, that the company actually keep a roster of your employees and whether they are or are not vaccinated. A lot of companies take issue with that. A lot of employees are going to take issue with that. Frankly, I think a lot of your employees are going to say, no, I'm not going to provide that information. Whether I'm vaccinated or not is none of your business. And they actually can do that. Employees don't have to provide this. If the employee does not provide their proof of their vaccination status, the company just treats them as unvaccinated, and they would have to follow all the rules for unvaccinated employees.
Hey, John, I'm going to chime in there just really quick. It's not some people think it's a HIPAA violation for employers to ask this question. It's not a HIPAA violation. Don't let your employees characterize it that way. There may be other reasons why they don't want you to ask that, but HIPAA is not one of them.
Yep, that's right, Tom. You're right about that. I appreciate you weighing in on that issue. Here's the last slide that talks about what the requirements are. And what I've done here is I've hit this at a high level. Again, I've basically summarized the 450 pages or so of regulations. And there's more to it than I've covered here. There's actually a lot more to it than what I've covered, but I'm trying to cover the high points. The last point of what employers are required to do is that you are required to communicate your policy to your employees. So by December 5th, you will have had to have prepared a written policy and communicated it to your employees in writing. And the regulations go into more detail on that. They say you have to provide the employees with a copy of the policy so that they know what the requirements are. And then there's a bunch of other documents that OSHA says you have to give to the employees, some specific notices. There's a document that the CDC has prepared called Key Things to Know About COVID-19 Vaccines. You have to provide a copy of that to your employees. You also have to provide some notices to employees about some of the anti-discrimination laws. You have to provide them with some notices about criminal penalties that employees could experience if they lie about their vaccination status, which is a very interesting concept. But employers have to provide some specific documents to the employees. My view is the easiest way to cover this is to simply include those documents along with your policy that you are providing to employees as you do that. There's some pretty easy ways to just include that, to wrap that all up into one single communication to employees. That's something that I've worked with a lot of companies on, is to prepare a policy that just sets all of this out. So there's just one communication that goes out to your employees that explains all of these requirements. So that covers at a high level the requirements that companies are required to go through. I want to speak to the current status here. In fact, I've had a lot of businesses reach out and say, we were working on implementing this. As soon as the OSHA mandate came out, we started working on it. Now we're hearing about all these court cases and we don't know what to do. I want to explain really clearly what has happened now and what's going to happen next. As soon as the OSHA regulations came out, actually within a couple hours of the OSHA regulations coming out, lawsuits were filed all over the country by state attorneys general, by private companies, in an attempt to stop these OSHA regulations. Lots of lawsuits. And very quickly, one court, a court in Texas, we call it the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, issued a stay of the OSHA vaccination requirements. Now, it's interesting because people are treating it, or a lot of people are saying that court stopped this whole OSHA thing. Let me be clear, that court did not stop the OSHA mandate. What that court did is they issued a temporary stay saying that they're staying implementation of the OSHA requirements, at least within that circuit, which consists of Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, but not Idaho, and said that on a temporary basis, they're staying it so that they can actually look into the issue and issue a decision on the merits as to whether the OSHA regulations are valid or if they're unconstitutional. One court has weighed in. There's all these other lawsuits that have not yet weighed in. There's some really interesting details of what's going to happen now. It's unclear what court is going to issue a decision. The way this works legally is that all these lawsuits are filed around the country. What I'm understanding, what I'm hearing is that all those lawsuits are going to be consolidated and they're going to go to one court that's going to make the decision. That court may or may not be that same Texas court that already weighed in a bit. In fact, I think it's more likely than not that it will not be. It's actually by a lottery procedure. They take all these lawsuits that have been filed, they put them all, and this isn't exactly how they do it, but they put them in a hat and they draw one that wins the lottery. Not wins is probably not the right word, but by a lottery decision, they decide which court is going to issue the initial ruling on this, and some court's going to be the one that issues the decision. And they're either going to say these OSHA rules are constitutional, go full speed ahead, or they may stop all of this. Regardless of what that court decides, I think pretty much all of us are certain that this is going to get appealed up to the United States Supreme Court. And at some point, the United States Supreme Court is going to make a decision where they're either going to allow the OSHA mandate to proceed, or they may stop it. My guess might be a little more educated than others, but it's a guess as to what the court's going to do. They may allow this to go forward, they may stop it. And that creates a lot of uncertainty for employers. What I've heard a lot of companies say is, I've heard some companies say, we're just going to sit on the sidelines and wait to see what happens. I want to give you some really specific recommendations of what I think you should do, especially those of you that are with big companies making decisions on what to do here. And I'll start this by saying this is not me saying what I think the recommendation is here. I'm going to talk about what the big employer associations are saying and what the White House is saying. Every association out there that's talking about these is saying that the smartest thing for a company to do is to plan as if you're going to implement the OSHA requirements as of December 5th, which is the date by which you have to send out your policy. And this actually just makes a lot of sense from a planning perspective. What makes sense is for the company to prepare as if this is going to happen, because there's a pretty good chance this is going to happen. It may not, but there's also a very good chance that you're going to be required to do all of this by December 5th. SHRM, which is the Society of Human Resource Management, it's the big national association of human resources professionals. They've come out and they said our recommendation is that employers should plan to implement the OSHA vaccination rules, plan to have a policy in place ready to go by December 5th, and proceed in that course. Similarly, the White House has said that, right? Even after that one court in Texas issued its temporary stay, the White House said, employers, what you should be doing is preparing your policy, having it ready to go, and proceeding with it so that you're ready to go, unless and until a court officially comes out and says that we don't have to follow these OSHA requirements. That's what I'm recommending to my clients. Every business I've talked to about this, I've said what you should do is go ahead and prepare your policy, make those decisions about how you want to do this, have it ready to go, so that in the next week or two, you're ready to roll it out. I think that just makes sense. That's the right approach here. This stuff happens. It's happened several times with these employment laws where they come out, employers have to get ready for them, and then there is some chance that they may get stopped. That is our recommendation for you, is that you go ahead and prepare as if this is going to happen. That if it doesn't happen, it's actually pretty easy to pull the plug on it if you decide not to proceed with any type of a vaccination policy. Let me explain here then, to wrap us up, the specific recommendations that I have for you on what an employer should do to prepare to comply with these OSHA regulations. And a lot of this I've kind of covered as we go, but I want to be really specific about what it is that each company is going to need. First of all, by December 5th, you need to have a written policy that complies with all these regulations, that explains what it is the company's going to do, right? Whether you're going to issue an actual vaccination mandate, or whether you're going to allow employees to either be vaccinated or test. So you need to have that written policy all ready to go. The second thing that you're going to want, separate from your policy, is a written communication from the leadership of your company. In my view, this should be coming from the CEO or the chairman of the board, or from the site manager, whoever is probably the highest up person within the company that would be communicating to employees. And you're going to explain to your employees what the requirements are. Frankly, in my view, that may be the most important piece of this from the strategy perspective of a company, of trying to figure out what message you want to send to employees. Some companies are going to use that communication to try to send a very strong message to employees that we want you to be vaccinated. We're going to make some requirements here. We're going to be very strict in enforcing this. That may be the approach that some companies are going to take, is taking a very strict, strong approach towards vaccination in that communication. Other companies may take a different approach of course, explaining that we're required to comply with the OSHA requirements, but to use this communication as an opportunity to send a message to employees that we're not doing this because we as a company wanted to make this decision to require vaccines, but rather we are doing this because we're required to do so under OSHA. Kind of focusing on the fact that lots of other companies are doing the same thing, frankly, to try to send a message to employees of, don't take this out on us, right? Don't protest us, the company. Don't blame the company for making this decision. We're doing this because we're being required to do this. You could even, in that communication, depending on the culture of the company and your philosophy on this, you could even make a communication about, your views on whether you think this OSHA vaccine, these OSHA regulations are overbearing, right? That type of kind of message that says, hey, we're not doing this because we wanted to do this, but rather because the government is requiring it. There's a lot of strategy that goes into the best way to communicate that to your employees in the way that you think will help you with your objectives, both as far as vaccination of your workforce and also your strategic objectives of not losing employees, not having employees walk off and say, I'm out of here because I object to what the company is doing here as far as vaccines. I think that's a really tricky issue for employers to work through. It's going to be a tough thing for employers to figure out their strategy on this. Also, by December 5th, the other things you're going to want to have is a certification form that every employee fills out, where they check the box saying they are or are not vaccinated, and where they provide you their proof of vaccination. That's an important form. That actually is what, in the event that OSHA inspects your company as far as compliance with these regulations, which OSHA says it can do, and which OSHA says it can issue fines and penalties for, that's the form that you're going to need to be able to show OSHA that you're compliant with this. You're going to have to show them those forms, and you're going to have to show them your log that shows that you are recording who is and who isn't vaccinated. And then the other thing that you're going to need to have is your exemption forms, a form that explains how employees can request exemptions. There's also some strategy into those forms. There's not a standard form that says what your form has to say. There's some different ways you can write up those forms to send messages to your employees about how restrictively you are going to grant those exemptions, or perhaps how accommodating the company wants to be in granting those exemptions. There's some strategy that goes into the best way to do that.
So John, my impression is this is not really a cookie cutter type of situation, given the different approaches that companies can take to this vaccine mandate. What role do attorneys have in this, and what can we do to help people with this?
Yeah, good question, Tom. You're absolutely right. This is not a cookie cutter approach. There are some sample policies floating out there. I will tell you, most of those sample policies are garbage. Either that they don't comply with the requirements, or that they send too strict of a message. There's actually some some sample policies that that the OSHA folks are suggesting that, in my view, don't give the company enough leeway. My view is that a company needs to make these strategy decisions and then issue a policy that both complies with the regulations and that fits their culture and the goals that they're trying to set out here. A law firm like ours helps companies prepare a policy that both complies with the goals or complies with the regulations and helps the company accomplish their goals. I've drafted many of these policies. We've worked with lots of companies on the best way to do this.
So John, we've just got 3 minutes left, but there are 2 questions that have been queued up. I'm going to take one, and I want you to take one.
Great.
The first one that we got that I want you to take is that there's a question from a company who owns 3 restaurants, each that has less than 100 employees, but collectively the 3 restaurants under one ownership group have more than 100 employees. How are they treated for purposes of the mandate?
Yep, that's a good question. That's a very common question. And the regulations provide surprisingly little explanation of how OSHA is going to look at that, other than to say there's some clear examples. I believe that if you got 3 businesses, restaurants, whatever, with common ownership, meaning the same person owns them all, and they are run in a single enterprise, like different restaurants with the same name in 3 different locations, clearly you're going to be covered here because you've got over 100 employees total. If you've got 3 different legal entities and they are operated separately, then you have a much better argument that you're excluded. But what the regulations say is that it comes down to the extent to which those companies are operated together, and in particular, their safety functions. So if you've got one person overseeing the safety functions of them all, you're probably going to be covered and be required to follow the OSHA regulations. That's that one. Tom?
Okay, great. Our next question, and John, if you know the answer to this, jump in. I'll bet you don't. But if an employer chooses to pay for the testing, does that cause taxable income or a taxable benefit to the employee? If you know, John, go ahead. But I've got an alternative answer if you don't.
I don't know. The regulations don't speak to that. In a lot of ways, that's a tax question. I don't know the specific answer to that question.
And to the person who posed that question, I've reached out to one of our tax attorneys and asked that question. I suspect he's at lunch right now. If you want to follow up with us later, we will weigh in on that. And I don't know if it's a quick question to answer, but if it is a quick question, we'll be happy to answer it for you. But that's where we sit on that. That's out of my wheelhouse and outside of John's wheelhouse. But excellent question. So thank you.
Great. Hey, I appreciate the opportunity to share this stuff. I know when this has come down, most companies in Idaho have reacted very negatively to these requirements, right? Lots of companies have the position that this is overbearing on the part of OSHA. I understand that concern. If this happens the way it's set out, companies are going to have to follow this stuff, and we're happy to help companies figure out the best way to do so. So thanks for having me here.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks to the Chamber for hosting this with us. As I said, we appreciate our relationship with the Chamber and with the Idaho business community.
Thanks, guys. As we conclude our conversation with Tom and John, a final thank you to them for sharing all this information with us, and also to the sponsor that made this possible, Intermountain Gas Company. Thank you so much for participating in our presentation today. I hope you were able to take a lot of good insights back for your business, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.